Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're plunging into a topic you might think you already understand. Short-term mission trips. We're going to explore the surprising history behind how even a 2-week trip came to be seen as missions.
That's right. It's funny, we often think of missionaries in a very specific way, maybe, a traditional way. But the evolution of short-term missions it's a really fascinating story. It tells you a lot about how mission work itself has been understood.
Yeah, and practiced. So to get to the bottom of this, we've been digging through a study that focuses on the North American evangelical mission community.
Right.
It looks at archival materials, writings of key figures, and sort of how this concept developed over time within that specific context, right?
Exactly. And that's a really important point to stress. This is one particular angle. There's a much broader global historical picture of mission work out there.
Definitely. Countless other stories, different Christian traditions, perspectives from all around the world. But today our focus is specifically on this North American evangelical narrative. So buckle up. We're about to take some, maybe unexpected turns, tracing how short-term missions emerged, the initial debates, and the forces that really pushed them into widespread acceptance.
Yeah, it should give you a new lens by the end.
Hopefully. A brand new way of looking at the landscape of modern mission work.
Yeah.
Okay, let's unpack this then. Our first stop is the mid-20th century, this time that mission scholars called an age of unparalleled crisis. What was going on then?
Well, what's fascinating here is you have several major anxieties kind of converging right at the end of the 1950s. Scholars like Arthur Glasser and Eric Fife, they highlighted political challenges, think the rise of communism, nationalism.
Right, big global shifts.
Huge shifts. And social challenges, too, like racism, inequality, and even theological challenges, things related to the World Council of Churches, more liberal theologies popping up in Europe and Latin America. It felt like a lot was changing.
It sounds like a really turbulent time. And Ralph Winter, another key evangelical mission scholar, he called the period from 45 to 69, 25 unbelievable years. That's quite a label.
It is, isn't it? And it really captures the mixed feelings of that era. Because on one hand, you actually saw significant growth in missionary organizations linked to the National Association of Evangelicals.
Okay, so these were newer, more theologically conservative groups.
Yeah, often more independent from the established denominations. And these newer agencies, they seem to be gaining momentum, fundraising, recruiting, offer outside those older structures.
So there was growth, but you said mixed feelings. There was unease, too.
Precisely. Winter also talked about this deepening pessimism about missionary work overall. It was influenced by all that global unrest we mentioned, the political stuff, the social changes, and those theological shifts, too. So even within the evangelical community, despite their own growth, there was this kind of prevalent feeling of being thwarted and threatened, as the study puts it.
That's really interesting. Even with positive numbers, this sense of pressure was still there. And this anxiety, it started showing up in evangelical publications, too.
Oh, absolutely. You saw it in magazines like Christianity Today and the Evangelical Missions Quarterly, which actually launched in the mid-'60s. They had articles worrying about, a potential dip in missionary enthusiasm.
A candidate shortage, I think one article called it.
That's the phrase, yeah. And mission professors like Herbert Kane were publishing books with titles that really reflected this anxiety, basically asking, where are the future missionaries?
So this backdrop of crisis, this sort of urgency to rally support, that seems key for understanding how the idea of short-term missions started to gain traction.
It definitely sets the stage.
Now, before this shift really got going, what was the traditional understanding? Who came to mind when people back then thought of a missionary?
Well, the figure who often looms large is William Carey. British Baptist, went to India, late 18th century. He's often called the father of modern missions.
Right.
And his model was really about long-term commitment, dedicating himself to learning local languages, translating scripture, really adapting deeply to the culture. That set a powerful precedent.
So someone making a lifelong commitment, really embedding themselves for the long haul. That's a high bar, isn't it? Makes the later idea of short-term quite a big shift.
A huge shift. And by the time you get to the 1910 World Missionary Conference in Edinburgh, which was a major event for international Christian cooperation, the dominant understanding, overwhelmingly, was that a missionary was someone committed to lifetime service.
Okay, lifetime service was the gold standard.
Right.
But were there any exceptions? or variations even back then.
Yes, that's important too. Fixed-term service did exist in some traditions. The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, the LDS Church, they had missionaries serving fixed terms pretty early on.
Oh, interesting.
And Mennonites, American Friends, they instituted similar service periods in the 1920s. Even some mainline Protestant denominations later adopted shorter terms. But the understanding of the vocation often differed.
How so?
Well, in some of those groups, there might have been less emphasis on what evangelicals considered traditional evangelism compared to their perspective.
So even where shorter terms existed, the purpose and maybe the definition of missionary wasn't quite the same.
Exactly. For those really holding to that traditional view, rooted in Edinburgh and figures like Carey, the whole idea of a short-term missionary initially seemed like, well, almost a contradiction in terms.
Especially if it had a set time limit or wasn't focused squarely on evangelism and church planting.
Precisely. That just didn't fit the established mold.
Okay, that makes sense. So with this really strong emphasis on long-term commitment, what were the big forces that started nudging the evangelical community towards considering and then eventually embracing short-term missions?
Well, like we touched on, the 1960s were just a time of huge social and political upheaval in the U.S., and those broader changes definitely had an impact.
You mean things like youth movements?
Absolutely. Think about the Peace Corps or Operation Mobilization. They really demonstrated the appeal of short-term service, that kind of engagement, especially for young people. Campus organizations were also key in fostering this idea.
Right. It was a time of, idealism.
Yeah.
A real desire to get involved and change the world.
Exactly that. And then you layer on the technological and economic factors. The rise of affordable mass commercial air travel. That was huge.
Suddenly it was possible for more people to go places.
Way more possible. It made international travel for shorter periods much more feasible. And you saw tourism growing, especially to places like the Caribbean and Mexico. Plus, Americans started getting more vacation time.
Oh, yeah.
And you can't forget spring break becoming this, youth travel phenomenon.
So the world was shrinking, in a way. Shorter trips were becoming more normal in other parts of life. It kind of makes sense that this would eventually seep into how people thought about mission work, too.
It does seem like a natural progression looking back. These big societal shifts created an environment where the idea of shorter mission engagements could actually start to take root. But it wasn't smooth sailing. There was definitely initial resistance and debate.
Right. You mentioned early debates. Harold John Okenga, a big name in evangelical circles, he voiced concerns about short-term volunteers way back in 1959. What was bothering him?
Okenga was worried it might be a wasteful use of resources. He mainly saw short-termers as maybe a recruitment tool for long-term missionaries, but not much more.
So potentially valuable only if they signed up for the long haul.
Pretty much. He really emphasized the desperate need for permanent missionaries. He worried about churches sending, say, big groups for a summer, but only supporting a couple of long-term workers financially. For him, the focus had to stay on that lifelong commitment.
It sounds like the fear was that short-term might dilute the focus, maybe become kind of well-intentioned distraction from the real work.
That seems to be the core concern, yes. Sustained long-term engagement was the priority.
Okay, so that's one leader's perspective. What about the mission agencies themselves? How do they react initially?
Well, John Gratian from Africa Inland Mission, or A, he offered a really interesting perspective in 1968. He acknowledged this growing trend of short-term service. He noted young people spending a year or two on the field right after college, even older folks taking short assignments.
So even by the late 60s, it was becoming noticeable enough for agencies to comment on it.
It really was. Gratian even pointed out, kind of ironically, that AIM's own founder, Peter Cameron Scott, technically had a short service period because he died young.
Oh, wow.
But Gratian's point was that God looks at the life commitment even if circumstances cut it short. He specifically cautioned against viewing short-term missions as just, quote, an interesting couple of years, or a way to sort of tick the missionary service box and get it out of the way.
He was really stressing the motivation behind it, wasn't he? It had to come from a genuine calling, not just wanderlust or resume building.
Exactly. The heart attitude was key for him. And it's also really striking just to see the language change. In Okenga's 1959 interview, there wasn't really a common term like short-term mission. The interviewer had to kind of describe the concept.
Right.
But by 1968, Gratian uses the term easily, which shows there's this growing awareness, people are talking about it, even if they still have reservations.
Okay, so despite the reluctance and the debates, it feels like the sheer momentum was forcing mission boards to start paying attention.
Yeah.
How did they actually begin to adapt?
Well, the bigger evangelical mission organizations like the EFMA, that's the Evangelical Foreign Mission Association, kind of an umbrella group for agencies, they started to recognize it and figure out ways to incorporate short-term travel into their structures.
Oh, so.
It's interesting. Back in 1952, an EFM missionary retreat discussed recruitment and training, but there was zero specific mention of using short-term stints for practical experience.
So it just wasn't on the radar as a formal part of the pipeline yet?
Not at all. But fast forward to 1968, and the EFMA announces plans for a full-time director and their job to organize mission station tours for churches and student tours specifically for recruitment.
Ah, so that's a shift, a formal recognition of these shorter engagements, at least for connecting churches and finding future long-termers.
Exactly. Initially, it seems framed more as supporting the long-term effort building awareness, recruitment potential.
Gotcha.
And you see this elsewhere, too. Raymond Davis, who was the general director of Sudan Interior Mission, SIM, he wrote in 1965 about their short-term assignments under the Sudan Interior Program, or SIP.
Okay.
He emphasized this was mainly to support the long-term missionaries and the local church. He actually used the term short-term missionaries, but stressed it was a complement to lifetime service, not a replacement.
But did he see value in it?
He did. He specifically noted the profound impact these short trips had on the participants themselves, how it changed them.
Interesting. So SIM sounds like one of the earlier ones to formalize it, but still very much framing it within that long-term vision.
Right.
What about other big players like the Southern Baptists?
Well, the Southern Baptists also in 1965 introduced something called journeymen. These were 2-year terms aimed at recent college grads designed to assist career missionaries.
And journeyman. That term itself sounds kind of like an apprenticeship.
It does, doesn't it? And interestingly, they didn't use the term short-term missionary. Journeyman implies a step on a path, maybe part of a hierarchy, working towards becoming a career missionary.
So that emphasis on it being a pathway to long-term service just keeps popping up.
It's a recurring theme in these early stages. Then Wade Coggins, he did a survey for the EFMA in 1967. He found that, many affiliated agencies were using short-termers to some degree.
But it wasn't all smooth sailing.
Yeah, no, definitely not. There were still lots of questions, different levels of how much they promoted it. Big concerns were being raised about funding. Would short-term donations take away from long-term support? And just the overall cost-effectiveness. Was it really worth the investment?
So even by 67, while it was seen as useful by some, it wasn't quite widely accepted as missions in the same way as career service. The definition was still very much up for grabs.
Exactly. It was useful maybe, but was it missions? That was the question.
Which leads us neatly into the emergence of organizations specifically created to promote short-term work, like Short Terms Abroad or FTA. How did they push this redefinition forward?
STA was really pivotal. They formed in 1967, and their stated purpose was right there. Assist Christian missions through short-term personnel. They were actively trying to broaden that definition of missionary beyond just the career person.
So this is a real turning point, isn't it? An organization intentionally created to champion this new model.
Absolutely. They weren't just adapting, they were advocating.
They wanted to change the narrative.
Precisely. Judy Barr, who was with STA, wrote this manifesto in 1969. She argued that the work of a missionary was actually the responsibility of every Christian, not just those who went overseas long-term. She really pushed back against equating God's call only with that career service model.
Wow. That's a significant theological shift, almost democratizing the idea of mission work.
It really is. Now, STA's early efforts admittedly still focused quite a bit on long-term recruitment and providing specialized skills that missions needed. But they were definitely laying the groundwork conceptually for short-term workers to be seen as missionaries in their own right.
And they shared stories to illustrate the impact.
Yeah, their newsletters had testimonies, like Marlene Lefevre's experience in Japan. She went for a 1-year short-term assignment, ended up staying for 2. Stories like that highlighted the potential value.
And even STA's definition of short-term back then. Yeah. It was different from what we might think of today, right? A week or two.
Oh, completely different. Initially, they defined short-term as anywhere from a few months up to 2 years. Even later, the shortest option they listed was summer. That's still a pretty significant commitment compared to a 10-day trip.
Okay.
But the key thing STA did was start to reorient thinking away from the absolute necessity of a lifetime commitment. That shift initiated a change that eventually would allow much shorter trips to fall under the umbrella of missions.
So STA And groups like them, plus the changing social context, they were really chipping away at that traditional definition. How did alliances with other groups speed this up?
Well, the partnership between SDA and another group called Intercristo was really important. Intercristo was founded by Phil Butler, and initially it focused mainly on recruiting teachers for mission organizations.
Okay.
But in the 1970s, SDA started working with Intercristo specifically to promote short-term missionary service more broadly.
And Butler saw the potential there. He recognized the growing interest.
He definitely did. There's a letter from him in 1973 where he talks about the significant number of applications they were getting for short-term work. And he was urging mission boards, you need to dedicate staff to this, develop projects, orient people properly, follow up afterwards.
It sounds like he saw the need for more infrastructure around it, not just letting it happen haphazardly.
Exactly. He saw the potential, but also the need for structure. And he also got the importance of changing the image of a missionary.
How so?
He actually proposed a radio spot script. It was titled Pictures. The idea was to show people in non-traditional roles, like a missionary mechanic, a woman caring for kids, and call them missionaries.
Ah, that's clever.
Yeah. The tagline directed listeners to Intercristo to learn about short-term service. It was a very conscious effort to broaden the public's understanding, the Christian imagination of who could be a missionary, move beyond just the preacher or the long-term evangelist.
That reshaping of the image seems crucial for the conceptual shift to really take hold.
Absolutely. If you can change the picture in people's minds, you change the possibilities.
And it seems this growing acceptance, this changing image, eventually led to real institutional changes within the established mission structures, like the EFMA you mentioned earlier.
Yes, definitely. By 1975, Wade Coggins remember him from the survey. He was reporting back to the EFMA board about just how prevalent short-term missionaries were becoming. And he was raising the practical question, should we include them in our official statistics? And if so, how short counts?
The million-dollar question, even then. Still debated today, probably.
Probably. But the fact they were asking it officially was significant. And the very next year, 1976, the EFA made a big decision. They changed their dues structure. For the first time, it included short-term missionaries.
Wow. That's tangible proof of institutional recognition, isn't it? When the money structure changes, it shows a real shift in priority and acceptance.
It really does. It marks a formal acceptance. And sort of parallel to all this, you had student-oriented groups experiencing this massive surge in short-term foreign Christian ministry.
Right, like campus ministries organizing trips.
Exactly. Now, these two streams, the more established evangelical mission agencies adapting and these youth movements exploding, they operated somewhat separately at first. But eventually, in the 80s and 90s, they really converged. And you can't underestimate the role of youth energy and enthusiasm in the massive growth of short-term missions as we know it today.
It's really fascinating to trace how all these threads came together. The initial sense of crisis, the big social and tech changes, these specific organizations like STA pushing the definition, and then finally, the institutional buy-in.
Absolutely. It shows the concept of short-term missions, especially the really short ones, like a couple of weeks. It isn't some ancient practice. It has a relatively recent, quite debated history. It was driven by this complex mix of factors within that North American evangelical community. The very definition of missionary had to undergo a pretty profound transformation to get us here.
So, as you, our listener, reflect on maybe your own understanding or experiences with mission trips, does hearing this history change how you view them at all? What does it mean for how we think about service or commitment or the actual impact of these shorter engagements?
Yeah, and it raises important questions that are still relevant, right? As short-term missions continue to be such a huge part of the Christian landscape globally now, we have to keep asking, what's their purpose? How effective are they, really? And how do they relate to, the more traditional long-term forms of missionary work?
It really makes you wonder, is that redefinition of missionary finished? Or will it keep adapting and evolving in the 21st century as the world keeps changing, as community needs change? It's definitely something to keep thinking about. Thanks so much for diving deep with us today.
My pleasure. It's a fascinating history.